What is up, guys? It is the Bluebloods coming at you guys with another episode of our Pac-12 in 31 days theme, and we are joined by the voice of Stanford Football. He's also an Emmy-winning sports reporter and broadcaster. Scott Reiss is joining us today, and I just want to say I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, no problem.
Absolutely, man. So we got to start with just the crazy season that we saw the Pac-12 have this year. August 11th, Commissioner Larry Scott made the decision to postpone the season, which was later, I guess, changed, and we had a very, very condensed season, not much flexibility. It was condemned by a lot of people. Some people praised the early decision-making, but what was your personal initial reaction to the decision, and what was Stanford's plan actually if the decision isn't reversed?
Boy, there's a lot there. Personally, I wanted to play as much as anybody, right? I mean, not only am I a fan and it's my passion, but it's my job. So clearly I had a big stake in the game, but literally. I had no problem with them being cautious. I think that was the way to go. I think there were other conferences that were a little more willing to throw caution to the wind. And in some cases it worked out. In some cases they paid the price for it. I think the Pac-12 did a nice job in waiting it out. The one thing I would have liked to have seen done differently was they wasted about 2 weeks after they secured the batch of testing that would allow every program to test everybody every day. Essentially, the mechanism that allowed them return to play was this agreement for the mass testing. And yet after they secured that agreement, there was about a 2-week stretch in the middle of other conferences' seasons where they waited. And then they came back and said, oh, well, this testing's a game changer. So now let's schedule the start and let's get going. I think they could have gotten going 10 to 14 days earlier and played another game or two. And that would have, made a difference. When you're talking about 6 games for just about everybody in the conference versus 8 games, I think that's substantial. So other than that, I think that the conference went about it the right way. I think that it was an exciting season. I think having fewer games added a sense of urgency, right, to every single week. So there was certainly that. When you start talking about Stanford specific, it's a different conversation than I'm sure you'll have with anybody else in the nation. Because as you probably know, Santa Clara County, which is where Stanford is located, was the most restrictive county, not just in Northern California, not just in California, in the entire nation. It was the most restrictive county. And as you also probably know, Stanford was the one high major school that was forced to play every game on the road after week 2 of the season. So there was a time when I wondered, are they even going to do it? Are they going to say, we can't be on the road for 4 weeks? This is crazy. We're sick of jumping through hoops. We're just going to, call it a year and move on. But to their credit, and I give the Stanford administration a ton of credit for thinking outside the box, for finding ways to make this work and essentially do something that was, as far as I can tell, pretty unprecedented in college football, go on a 19-day road trip, right? I mean, the first road game was at Cal, so it's across the bay, and that at least is still in the Bay Area. But then you had 3 straight games outside of Northern California where they had to travel, and they just stayed put. They stayed in Washington for a week. They stayed in Oregon for a week. And so not only did they commit to playing all the games, somehow they won all 4 of those games, which is an achievement in and of itself. So it's something nobody associated with the program will ever forget. And, hopefully it makes them stronger going forward.
Right. And I mean, this is probably a tough question because only 6 games, and it was just it was almost chaos out west at times. I know there were a few teams that only got to play like 3-4 games because they had a cancellation every week. Then Washington doesn't even get to go to the Pac-12 championship game because they had COVID. Their rival goes on and wins it. Just chaos. But 4-2 season, I thought it was a really, really good season for Stanford. You mentioned the 4-game win streak to end the season, and the losses not only were close losses, but were to really good teams. So I thought it was a very respectable season. But for you, did this season meet, exceed, or fall short of your preseason expectations?
It's hard to say because any pre-COVID expectations were so quickly forgotten once we got into the pandemic that once it became time to actually play football in the middle of the fall, I had no expectations because I had no idea, what to expect in terms of everything you just mentioned. You don't know, if and when and who's going to be playing in any given week. So if you had asked me before we started play, would I take 4-2 with, a couple of losses to good teams? Yeah, I probably would have taken that. I will say this, and this is just sort of, barroom chat at this point. It means absolutely nothing. But if you go back and you take a closer look at what happened in those first two games, which were the only two losses, Stanford had to go up to Oregon, which is obviously a tough game in week 1. And 3 hours before kickoff, they find out that Davis Mills, who's their quarterback, who is now a second-round pick of the Texans, had a positive COVID test and couldn't play. And so all of a sudden, you're forced to go with a kid who had, one game of collegiate experience, who was not in the stratosphere of Davis Mills. And Stanford was still in the game in the fourth quarter, wound up losing by, I think, 12. And you look at that game and you say, well, if Davis Mills plays that game, maybe the outcome is different. Oh, by the way, it was a false positive. So it completely robbed him and the team of whatever might have happened. Well, not only did the false positive keep him out of that game, but because of protocols, even after they cleared him, he wasn't allowed to practice until Friday of the next week, which is one day before the Colorado game. And he was rusty as all get out, hadn't played a football game in, more than a calendar year, and he wasn't himself. We wound up losing that game. So it's not a stretch to think, man, if the false positive didn't happen, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about 5-1? Are we maybe even talking about 6-0? Now, look, I can't tell you they would have won both of those games, but it would have been an entirely different story with your superstar starting quarterback playing instead of a backup who wasn't quite ready for prime time. So I guess in answer to your question, big picture, yeah, I think the season was a success. And again, winning the last 4 is something that hopefully, you can carry a little momentum over to a more normal scenario this year.
Right. And you mentioned Davis Mills. He led this team, but now he's off to the NFL, and I'm sure he's going to have a great NFL career. He was kind of like right below like those top 4 guys in that 5-7 range, but it leaves Tanner McKee, Jack West as the 2 quarterbacks fighting for the QB1 role. I've been kind of reading up on different blog posts, 247. It's kind of a shift. Like some people think one guy has a strong lead. The other one says it's an open competition. For you, what do each of these quarterbacks bring that's unique to the table? And who is the favorite in your eyes right now to be that QB1?
So I will confirm it is an open competition. I think that so Jack West is a senior. What he brings is experience. He started 2 games, the game against Oregon last year where he played well, the game against UCLA his sophomore year where he will be the first to tell you he did not play well, and it was not but it was, deer in headlights, first collegiate game. He was the 3rd string guy thrown into action. So I think they are comfortable with Jack West being the quarterback, but Tanner McKee is an entirely different level of ability and upside. This is a blue chip, top high school quarterback in the country type recruit. Tanner McKee went on a 2-year Mormon mission. So even though he is a sophomore, he is the same age as Jack West, who is 2 classes above him in school. And I think that matters here because anybody who's followed Stanford over the years knows that David Shaw is reluctant to throw underclassmen into the fire at the quarterback position because the offense is so complex. The playbook is like an encyclopedia this thick. But in McKee's case, yes, he's a true sophomore, but he's also 21 years old and a kid who has, he's bigger, he's stronger. So that may mitigate the difference between the two in terms of readiness, physical maturity and readiness to play. Again, officially it's an open competition, but to answer your question directly, I think Tanner McKee is the favorite. He is an uber talented kid who, if he gets the start week 1, should start every game barring injury for at least the next 2 years, if and when he decides to move on to the NFL. And he is of the, and again, I hate to put anybody in the Andrew Luck category because that's hallowed ground, but in terms of raw talent coming out of high school, he's in that Andrew Luck Davis Mills type pedigree of what he brings to the table. So sky's the limit. And if he wins the job, I think it elevates the upside of this offense a lot.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to go to next. He looked outstanding in the spring game. I went back and watched a lot of that spring game, and I get, he looked great. The QB competition was the biggest storyline, but what other storylines were you watching this past weekend, and what were your biggest takeaways from spring practice as a whole?
Boy, so many storylines with everybody, right? I mean, every program, every team is going to have a ton of storylines. For Stanford, you really needed the roster and the cheat sheet going into spring ball. They lost a ton of guys. They had 5 guys drafted. They had 5 more signed as undrafted free agents. So that's 10 dudes who were stars on your team for the last year or 2 or 3 who are now gone. So there's an overhaul. Now, the good news is Stanford's got a lot of depth. They got a lot of talent, and they've been so incredibly, honestly, unimaginably banged up the last 2 years. I've never seen anything like the laundry list of injuries in 19 and 20 that you figure you're due for a little good luck, a little injury regression. And a lot of those guys who should have played major roles the last 2 years and couldn't, hopefully will be back. And so that's storyline. Other than the quarterback, that's probably the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th biggest storyline on this team is injuries. And will these guys who have been banged up and hurt for the last year or 2 be ready to play? Because there's a lot of talent that we just haven't seen on the field. So, some of them played in the spring game on Saturday. Many of them, I would say most of them did not, but in most cases it was just precautionary. Coach Shaw wants to, keep a lot of these guys in bubble wrap until we get to the summer and the fall. But that's really what I'm looking at. It's sort of big picture is, especially on the defensive side of the ball, can we get these guys who we think are going to be really good football players actually on the field?
Right. That's always an important thing. I know a lot of teams always, if there's even just a small injury, it's like we're going to keep them off the field. We can't afford. We see it every year. I mean, look at Georgia. They lost like 3 wide receivers, all just torn ACLs here, torn meniscuses here. But I want to look at the recruiting cycle. I love talking recruiting. It's the key to college football nowadays. You have to recruit to keep winning. A top 50 class, headlined by some studs on both sides of the ball for Stanford. What for you were the biggest positional needs this recruiting cycle, and do you see any instant impact freshmen coming in for Stanford?
I think that if there's one position group that we will see an infusion of freshmen contribute, I think it might be defensive line, which is actually kind of odd because from a physical maturity standpoint, that's one of those positions where, you got to be big and strong, and a lot of these 17, 18-year-olds just aren't ready. But I think a combination of quality of guys that they've brought in and a need by guys who have vacated, right, attrition and folks who graduated and moved on, I think you're going to see rotational guys there. I think that Stanford at the linebacker and defensive back positions has so many returning guys who have either started or are capable and expected to be starting caliber players. I don't think there's a huge need for freshmen to come in right away. And on the offensive side of the ball, they're loaded, and you may not know a lot of the names at wide receiver and tight end and even running back behind Austin Jones, but they are very deep at all 3 positions and somewhat deep on the offensive line. So I think just from a need perspective, which is a good thing, right, is that they're not going to rely heavily on true freshmen, which is just fine, I think, with David Shaw and the coaching staff. That said, one of the interesting things to me, if you talk about some of the nuances of recruiting, was Stanford, one of the only schools I would imagine in the nation, certainly major conference schools, that has never allowed early enrollees. It's just never been a part of the university mission. It's never been something that the football program has been permitted to do in terms of in conjunction with the university. And with COVID this year, they loosened that up, and they actually brought 2 kids in who are on campus and practicing this spring. It's the first time ever that we've gotten to see kids who should be in high school actually practicing. One is a quarterback, Ari Patu, who actually got the last series Saturday in the spring game and looked pretty darn good. And the other was a cornerback, Jaden Slocum, who got a lot of reps in the spring game. And so it was cool to see kind of this evolution in the philosophy in terms of recruiting. And I hope that sticks. I don't think they're going to open the floodgates, but it would be nice to see them allow, 2 or 3 kids when the circumstances warrant, right, to be able to come in and be there for spring ball and kind of jumpstart their college careers.
Right. And kind of a follow-up on recruiting, I think Stanford was also one of the only schools in the country that really didn't utilize the transfer portal either. I believe this past class, I don't think we saw almost anybody transfer in. Is that just kind of David Shaw's philosophy? We saw Dabo Sweeney say, we don't want transfers. We're not taking any. We're good with where we are. Is that kind of David Shaw's approach, or is it just kind of we didn't see anyone that we wanted this year?
No, it's neither of those things. Stanford, the academic requirements are such that it is almost impossible to get into Stanford as an athletic transfer. Stanford, when it comes to requirements for football players out of high school, are they the same as non-athletes, your garden variety students? No. But they're close. Most schools, like, you got to be here to get in, but if you're an athlete, you can be way down here and you're good, right? Not at Stanford. In Stanford, maybe it's here and here. So when you talk about transfers, there's no gap whatsoever. If you're going to get in as a transfer, you've got to get into Stanford. And as we all know, that's tough to do. So it precludes 96% probably of kids in the transfer portal from even being in the conversation. So I can remember, you can count on one hand since I was an undergrad in 1994, the number of football transfers that have come in to Stanford. Brennan Scarlett is one that comes to mind, who was a graduate transfer because he came over from Cal, and now he's been with the Houston Texans for 5 or 6 years in the NFL. But there have been very, very few, and it's the same on the basketball side. Once every 2 or 3 years, there's the possibility of a kid who actually gets admitted. And but it's again, I count on one hand on the basketball side as well. So it's just it puts Stanford at a disadvantage. I mean, it flat out does. Most schools in the nation, they got big holes and they didn't get out and get a good recruiting class. They can just go Band-Aid it. Oh, look, a kid who's a senior who started for 3 years at Pitt or at Virginia or wherever else, and we'll plug him in and plug and play. We can't do that. So with Stanford, it is 99% relying on high school recruiting.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I know Stanford has very unique circumstances in terms of academic standards. So that is interesting, and that's something to keep an eye on. And I mean, David Shaw's done an outstanding job recruiting out of high school, so I'm sure it'll be just fine. But I want to shift to on the field performance for next year. Every year we see these guys come out of nowhere. We saw in the Pac-12 last year, multiple guys just say, man, where did that kid come from? He had his breakout season. Who on Stanford's team this year could come into 2021 and have their breakout year?
I'll give you a name on the offense and on the defense. On the offensive side, tight end, you probably know if you followed Stanford football at all for the last 10, 12 years, tight end right? I mean, the litany of great tight ends that have gone on to the NFL is impressive. The last couple of years, last year was probably one of only 2 years in the David Shaw era where they didn't have that at least one super stud tight end who was going to go out and be an all-conference performer at that position. I think they'll have that guy again. His name's Ben Yurosek. And he is a 6'4" kid who got his feet wet last year, played sparingly at the end of the year, but they are ready to unleash him this year. And that is a position that's going to come back. You're going to see tight end usage spike again, I think, this season. So that's one guy who I think is going to be on radars by the end of the season. Bradley Archer is another tight end who a name you wouldn't know, but those two guys are going to see a ton of reps, and they're both very talented pass-catching tight ends who are going to bring that element back to the offense. I'll give you one more as a wide receiver just because he's a stud. We did see him last year. His name's Elijah Higgins. He's built like a tight end. He's 6'3", 6'4", and I think he's like 230. But he plays the wide receiver position. He's one of those guys where getting off the bus, you're like, yeah, that dude, I don't want to be part of that guy. But Last year, it clicked for him the second half of the year, and he started making plays. Stanford's so deep at wide receiver. A year ago, there wasn't a lot of room for him. This year, he should start, and he should thrive, and the sky's the limit. So remember Elijah Higgins, that name as well. And on the defensive side, just look at the inside linebackers because that's going to go a long way toward determining Stanford's success. One of the names you would know is Gabe Reed. He's been in the program 5 years, but they moved him from outside to inside last year, so he'll start somewhere. But in addition to that, they've got 3 kids who they really, really like as inside linebackers, and all of them are true juniors, and they have probably combined to play in 4 games in 2 years because they are among the walking wounded guys who have missed just year after year after year. So I'll give you 3 names, file them away. Ricky Miezon is one, who was one of the top lacrosse players in the country out of high school, but he decided at the last minute to switch to football, and Stanford loves him as an inside linebacker, and he will probably start if he's healthy. Jacob Mangum-Farrar, another inside linebacker who has not paid a single down because he's been hurt for both of his years on campus, but he's ready to rock and actually played in the spring game and looked great in the one series, and Tristan Sinclair is a third. Those 3 guys at the inside linebacker position, if they are all upright and healthy and approaching what Stanford expects they can do, it's going to give a really nice rotation at a critical position because that's hurt them the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah, I'll be interested to see. Stanford's one of those schools, I don't know, I've always kind of been drawn to it. Just like the way they play is so unique with just that power style. But I know you got to get out here. So last question here. Looking ahead to 2021, Stanford has a brutal schedule. I mean, just to be completely honest, I'm a K-State grad student now, so I know that opening non-conference game against K-State is going to be tough with Skylar Thompson coming back. Road trip to USC week 2, no sleep there for Stanford. And then you also still have to play Oregon, Arizona State, Washington, and then end the season with Notre Dame, who's always one of the probably top 10 programs in the country. With this schedule, with everything you've highlighted so far, what is the ceiling and or floor for this 2021 Stanford team?
Well, first of all, somebody who's just looking at Stanford for the first time would say, wow, that schedule, that's crazy. We get this every year. And it's part and parcel to having Notre Dame on the schedule every year, because when your non-conference, starts with Notre Dame, right, and you don't schedule that, FCS patsy that a lot of schools do, you're by definition, you're going to have 3 tough games. And then, and when you're playing 9 conference games as the Pac-12 does. So we're used to it. Now, this year is particularly daunting because not only are you starting with 3 road games, but you also have the one you didn't mention, which is going all the way across country to play Vanderbilt at their place. So, that's legit, a 3,000-mile trip to play an SEC team on the road. The ceiling is compete for a Pac-12 North title. This team has the talent. If Tanner McKee wins the job, runs with the job, and becomes a, top 3rd Pac-12 quarterback, which is absolutely within the realm of possibility. And if they get these bodies back, particularly at the linebacker position on defense, and, they get good production and they can get some pressure on the quarterback, which has been a problem, that's the ceiling. I mean, there's no doubt the talent on this roster is good enough to compete for a conference title. I don't want to throw out what is the floor because you can never predict, if everything goes wrong. If they have, 20 guys out for the season like they have the last 2 years, it's going to be tough to compete in the Pac-12, right? So let's hope they stay healthy and that doesn't happen. But I'm excited. I think that it's the conference is good. Every week's a challenge, right? There's no weeks off. When your easiest non-conference game is at Vanderbilt, got to fly cross country, and there aren't a lot of gimmies in the conference now. Every week's a battle, but it's going to be fun, and I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Pac-12's at an all-time high, to say the least. But we appreciate you coming on the show, man. Where can our listeners find you and all the calls for the Stanford football team?
So nationally, tune in, right? That's where you get everybody streaming now on the TuneIn Radio app. We're there every week. And you can follow me on Twitter at Stanford Voice.
Absolutely. Make sure to go do that. We appreciate Scott coming on. We'll definitely be reaching out to him closer to the season. Guys, we continue our Pac-12 in 31 days with Arizona tomorrow. So make sure to tune into that. And this will be available all podcast stream platforms and YouTube. But for myself, For Scott and for the Blue Bloods, we are out.